I was originally introduced to photography by a friend of mine in San Antonio. I had grown up with him in Memphis, and he needed someone to come and help him in his portrait studio in Lackland Air Force Base, and he needed someone he could trust. Basically, I knew nothing about photography. He just needed a friend, somebody he could rely on. And so I went down. He showed me how to use this camera here. This is an 8 by 10 inch camera. Makes a transparency this size, and has all of the workings, the back, the perspective correction, and so forth. A technical camera from the 30s or 40s, I suppose. It's a Burke and James camera. It's the camera that I learned how to make photographs with. And of course, I didn't know anything about, what that meant to make a photograph. And using this was absolutely every aspect of it, from perspective to composition to lighting. And I didn't really realize the level of training I was actually getting, even though it seemed like it was a antiquated system. It was an antiquated system, but it gave me the basics in such a solid way that still apply today in terms of determining exposure and all these other things. What was required to operate that camera is incorporated in every digital camera that exists today. Light sensors and metering sensors and so forth. But when I came to Israel in 1985 the first time, I brought this camera. And as a child, I had seen these famous photographers that had come here in the 1800s when photography was a new medium. And Francis Frith, Salzman, and what's his name, Bonfils. As a child, for me, they inspired me. They're beautiful, warm sepia tone images in large format with all of these perspective correction possibilities. It's the same vintage, more or less, cameras. In the 1800s, it was the same type of camera that these guys were using, is what I learned on. There was a deep connection between the romanticism that they exhibited in their photographs with, and of course grew up in the Bible Belt in Memphis, and had a love of biblical stories, and David and Jonathan were my heroes, and so when I saw these photographers as a kid, long before I knew anything about photography, I just loved what they were doing. I saw straight away that they were romanticizing, and they would make photographs of the people of Israel, the people of the Holy Land at the time, and in something that would remind you of biblical ideas. 1985, my late father-in-law brought my wife, my son, and I to Israel. Vindel Jones was doing his mapping project of Jerusalem, and he asked if we would like to come and join him and help him work on this project. I, as a photographer, my wife as data input for the map. We spent about 4 months working around Har HaBayit, or the Temple Mount. I photographed I would position the camera to where, and then put a meter stick in the shot, and in each shot, after I'd make the photograph, I'd have the meter stick at the corner of the frame, and each shot I would move to the next width of the frame, width of field of view, and like that all the way around the old city walls. And then found, was asked to find the locations that we were photographing in Tanakh, or in the prophets, and those were going to be put to the map. So that was my introduction to Israel, and of course the Temple Mount, and all of these things. And I'm working there today. I've been working there ever since. Actually, just about ever since I've made Aliyah in 1991. So it's been my privilege to work there straight through, even till today. I remember when we first arrived, and I went to work at the Temple Mount, and first of all I said, "So where's the Mount?" And second of all, it was a veritable trash heap. you know, and it was very, very filthy. And I think there was even a garbage strike at the time we arrived, so there was garbage heaps everywhere. Everything was completely. It was very nasty, very difficult to appreciate any of the beauty that for instance, these 18th or 19th century photographers had romanticized. And so I did look at it from that perspective. I was seeing that in my mind's eye. So I was constantly, and I still do it today, I look for opportunities to kind of, you know, give a pastoral presentation to what is under the actual grime that exists. The winter season is the time I love to photograph in Israel. The light is low and polarized, but it seems to represent the depth of the society and the depth of the history, and the light. It seems to help you if you're seeing images that you want to express that sort of depth, that sort of beauty and ideas that have impacted so many different peoples around the world. It's easier to do when you have that kind of light to work with, and in the wintertime it's very beautiful. And everything, of course, is made of Jerusalem stone, so that particular type of limestone takes on a variety of color that ultimately goes into, even if you're not photographing a wall, it influences everything that you're photographing, more or less. And yes, the light's very different here than other places. My training in the United States, I realized after I'd come to Israel in 1985 that I needed a lot more training for the craft, for being able to supply lighting to a subject, and generally understand what the possibilities were with a camera, and have a lot more experience under my belt before I came here and tried to make a living doing it. So when I left Israel in 1985, I went back to Memphis, determined to find some people who loved Israel, spoke Hebrew, and immerse myself in some sort of photographic endeavor, whether it was school or whether it was what I finally figured out is that I thought it would be best to try to get into actual commercial photography, because it would probably be the most demanding. And I also, at the same time, I said, okay, commercial's great, but I know my tendency to want to do artistic things, so I'm going to have to aim at, as my skills get up, I'm going to aim at fine art. And what greater subject to use for that? So I headed that direction. I've stayed on that direction. I've been a part of several fine art projects here in Israel and around the world as a result of making Aliyah. Came here and went on a book of synagogues around the world a couple of years after I got here, and worked with a famous photographer by the name of Neil Fulberg, who's a wonderful, brilliant photographer, and we've done several book projects together. He needed someone to do lighting, so this is one of the ways that I've managed to be a little more versatile in being a commercial photographer, a professional photographer. This is probably the most important work I've ever done or ever will do, and in my opinion, it's some of the best work I've ever done, because it required all of the things that I was just describing. It required an understanding of lighting and technical cameras and large format things, and I processed all of I shot this with 4x5 film, 4x5 inch film, and I used, of course, supplied lighting, strobe lighting, and combined it with lighting that was in the tunnels and filtration and all of these different things that I had been trained to do as a commercial photographer. So it really taxed all of my ability, which was wonderful, and I came away with some very artistic imagery, to my opinion, and in a very singular place. Well, the most important and probably the finest photograph I suppose I ever made from from an artistic and technical perspective is this one of what they call the Holy of Holies. It's not actually the Holy of Holies, obviously, but the idea is that when you walk along the western wall of the Temple Mount, in these tunnels that have been excavated along that wall, you come to a place that's as close as you can get to the Holy of Holies. And of course, people stop and meditate and pray here and put their prayers in the wall. And it does take on its own form of holiness because of the prayers that go to heaven from here. And people from all walks of life, all sorts of backgrounds, from all over the world, literally all over the world, come to this place.
Where is that in relation to the Kotel, the wall of the Kotel?
This is the Kotel. You're looking at the Kotel, but it's the people typically relate to the Kotel as a plaza area in about middle way on the length of a 500-meter wall that's you see on the television and everything else, and it's outside. This is a tunnel that runs along that same wall just to the north of that plaza. So this is one example of an image that the 4x5 film just wouldn't see it without supplying lighting. It just would not, it wouldn't look like that. You wouldn't be able to make the photograph if you didn't come in with lighting and do the work. So
is that one exposure?
yes, it's one exposure. I should say it's multiple flashes for one exposure. In other words, the camera's set up, either, I don't remember offhand, either I cocked the shutter several times, or I simply opened the shutter and fired the strobe several times. I don't remember which on this particular image. But in any case, there's always the issue of moving the camera, you know, when you're doing these multiple exposures. You ask rightly, is it multiple exposures? Technically, yes, it is. But it's not, in today's terms in Photoshop, where you use layers, it would be more like that, because there are not separate pieces of film. It's all on one piece of film, those multiple exposures. So it's built up much like the layers in Photoshop, all on one image. Here, the challenge was to photograph something that was about as wide as my shoulders and just slightly taller than me, which is not very. And it was probably 150 meters long. And so, there's not much to look at here except for the repetitive forms of the structure that actually formed the tunnel itself. And but nevertheless, it was something that they had asked for. And the idea is that this image was a 24-minute exposure, stacked with filtration, you know, and there was no place to hide any lights, and so it was simply, it just had to be a long exposure. The light was fairly even, and but it was a situation where I applied everything that this camera was capable of doing. It used the ability, the technical ability of this camera, this equipment, to its maximum efficiency in order to get something 150 meters sharp. This is the tunnel along the western wall of the temple. So that's a couple of places that, to go back to your original question of how I've made a living here, this is why they hired me to do this, because there was nobody else really at the time that, and there might have been other people that would have been capable of it, perhaps. I doubt very seriously if most of them, and I'm talking about maybe 5 or 6 people in the country, and that had that kind of equipment. But if they had that kind of equipment, they probably would not have been willing to do that work because of the complexity and the difficulty of it. And probably, you know, it didn't necessarily pay that well, but it meant something to me, which was another element that I brought to the work. It was meaningful to me, and most of the other people that I know of that were at that time technically capable might not have brought that sort of interest to it. So I was fortunate. I was in the right place at the right time. This is an image in the Kidron Valley it's called Chizir's tomb, Kever Chizir. Chizir is the family name, It sounds an awful lot like chazir, which is pig, and but it turns out that it was a priestly family, Kohanim. And if you notice in the background of the image, you're looking up at the wall around the Temple Mount. So from inside the tomb, of course, we have a Jewish tradition that you know, the dead will actually live again. These people, privileged class, buried in such a fine mausoleum there just opposite the Temple Mount, obviously had that belief, and it's a good example of that. This is a situation that happens so often in landscape photography that you can see an image and you can see it in your mind's eye the way you want the film to see it, and it doesn't really exist until certain conditions exist. And I was fortunate that the day was actually very overcast, but it was coming and going. And so I had to wait till it could be open enough outside such that there was plenty of light inside and plenty of, to expose for the dark interior of the mausoleum, as well as see the bright exterior. And so it's lighting, but it's knowing what to look for, what the film will see, what the film will record. And of course, film's not an issue anymore, but it's the same rules, just like I learned on this 8x10" camera and used 4x5 for all of these. The same rules apply to make good photographs with a digital camera today, even if it's a point and shoot. And if you follow those rules, then you'll come with nice images no matter what kind of camera you're using. So there are other images here that were, I think one of the principal things I like about this particular book is that it's the quintessential blend in my career of art, meaningful work with commercial application, because I was hired to do this over the course of, I don't know, from 1996 I began. And this is a photograph I started in 1996 that they requested. They wanted something that showed the tunnels untouched, as it were, and they wanted it to look like a cave instead of a tunnel. And which is interesting, because some of these some of the underground passages in and around the Temple Mount are actually natural fissures that were supplemented or subsequently dug for, you know, the water, transporting water or whatever they used it for, usually water. This is the water tunnel so they call it the Hasmonean water tunnel. They believe that it was built or cut in the Hasmonean period to the Temple Mount to supply water for all of the offerings and so forth. So it was a success, and those were the kinds of things. This is the final image. It's rare in that you can't see this anymore if you go into the tunnels, because they had put a glass bridge over the actual channel that was cut into the bedrock to carry the water. And it was really a lovely way to experience the tunnel and see, you know, the way that the water actually went to the Temple Mount. But they've since taken that out, and they've actually, I guess, diverted whatever water was there, and you just walk on the floor. You walk down now on the floor where the water once flowed, and they took the glass bridge out. And so that image doesn't exist anymore, but it's one of my favorite images. I had to light this with available light. I took what lights that they had in there. Strobes would not stand around in there. The glass bridge is some 10 feet above the water channel, and it, of course, is very narrow. It's about as wide as my shoulders, and they already had some lights standing in there that I could not take out. So this was a situation where I had to compose an image where I could use the light that existed, move it slightly here, slightly there, filter it, or gobo it, or, you know, some way block if it was too much, or put some sort of diffusion over it, some sort of adjustment where the 4x5" film would see it. And so I was very pleased with the image. It's also a very beautiful and graphic image. So while working with Folberg on these various projects around the planet, the book of the Coattail Tunnels, and then the City of David. I've been working at the City of David through all the years, and can you see that? And this is an image that again, it was both of these sites, the Cotel Tunnels and the City of David, are sites that most of the people who work there have big hearts and are very idealistic and so forth, and they really want to do things the best they can in their estimation. But often they because they're volunteers, not professionals. It's changed a lot now; they're much more professional. But originally, when I started there, they were just beginning too, and they were not by any means professional graphic artists or designers or any of that kind of stuff. And to convince them that they needed to use this as an icon for the City of David, they didn't begin to understand what I meant. And of course I had the issue of language, which was, you know, I think they understood the word icon, but they didn't have an understanding of marketing and of you know, catching people's attention with an image that speaks about a site like this one does. We're talking about the origins of Jerusalem, and for all the world this looks like birth waters of Jerusalem. I mean, which is precisely what it is. And of course I went in with that sort of idea in mind, and they were thinking, we just need some pictures, you know. We need some pictures of the site, you know. And so when I started doing this, they were taken aback because it wasn't what they expected at all, and they didn't know how to look at it. They didn't understand what they were seeing. And so when I was doing some of my finest work in my estimation, and my most important work with regard to Jerusalem, they were wanting to just nix it because they felt like it wasn't what they had expected. They wanted something. Where's the light? How come it's not bright? I can't see anything, you know, or you know what? There's no people in there, or you know, all these kinds of ideas. But over the course of, I guess, since the late '90s, I started working there in '99, I believe, and you know, they've begun to appreciate, you know, that I'm trying to make a statement about the place. While it's a commercial job, I'm trying to make imagery that will speak in and of itself about the place. And it's not easy. It takes a lot of effort, you know, it's a lot of thought, and sometimes they just don't exist. But I'm quite proud of this. This image was used, they took my advice finally, and they used it on buses all over Jerusalem, and they used it on all of the signage for Ir David. For years they still use it. And of course they put it on the cover of their book, and it's on public, it's everywhere. They got it. They did it.
Like you should have said.
Yeah, so, and it was much the way they did I had to do the same kind of thing to convince them about that Kadosh Kadoshim, Holy of Holies photograph, that is the best photograph there. That needs to be the cover, you know, and the same principle. But there's a degree of satisfaction in that it came out that way. It's a lot of satisfaction because they did finally see it my way, and that it was really, thank God, you know. I think it's for everybody's benefit that they did. There's an image in here that I was going to show that that I think is very special because I tried to, when digital photography was still sort of in its infancy here in Israel, it was nevertheless completely adopted. In other words, as soon as digital cameras were available, everybody in Israel was asking for only digital work. For some unknown reason, they only wanted digital work because they thought that it was just old-fashioned to use film. And so I had to make this transition, whether I liked it or not. I still had all the state-of-the-art 4x5 equipment. I had 2 4x5 cameras and all this lighting, and I had a Hasselblad and a couple of Bronicas, and you know, I had 35 millimeter. I had all this camera equipment that built up for you know, 20 years of experience, and nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted to use it. Nobody would, and I had already done a good percentage of what was already published in these things. I bought a camera, a Nikon camera, that would produce the equivalent of 35 millimeter, and then I realized that I could turn it vertically and make composite images, and then I would turn around and have something on the order of 60 megabytes of information, and on certain scenes that were like what I might have shot with 4x5 previously. So I set about making all sorts of photographs like that, and this is one of them. And I learned to try to find imagery that was conducive to that sort of an application. So this is a series of images. It's about, I think there were maybe 11 or 12 images here, and so I'm well over 100 megabytes of information here. And you know, I could make this image really, really large if I wanted to. And but besides that, it's a very special place. And here I am bringing in all of this work the latest or the highest, you know, state-of-the-art application of the equipment to antiquity, to, you know, fundamentally earth-changing, life-changing, you know, imagery. I'm not talking about just my photographs. What I mean is that Israel itself, and this is the tomb of David, and so certainly the Psalms of David have influenced and comforted and inspired people from all over the world, and to have the opportunity to have work published using, you know, as much as state-of-the-art equipment as possible, and try to make some sort of inspiring imagery. It's a wonderful challenge, a wonderful opportunity. I mean, why would I want to live anywhere else if this is what I'm doing? So, in the footsteps of Frith, you know, I'm trying to romanticize from my childhood what has inspired me through the years, and to try to make a living doing it is no small challenge. But thank God I've been very fortunate. But this is an image from, it's just opposite what we call Zion's Gate on the Temple Mount. And this is a road. There was a publication by Carta, an Israel mapping company, that published, I believe, in about 1972. Archaeologist Danny Bahat was writing on this site, and I believe he described this as a second temple set of steps. Second temple era would be first, you know, roughly the 1st century BCE or 1st to 1st century CE. And but what we found in so often is that when you find these archaeological anomalies, that they're there because there was something there previously. And the same thing was there previously, like the road. So this road runs through a valley to the south of the Temple Mount called the Hinnom Valley. This was, for all intents and purposes, this was the road to Zion. And it runs, if you stand on that step right there and look straight in front of you, to your left about 10 o'clock, let's say, about, you know, 20 degrees, would be the Temple Mount. You'd be looking right at Har HaBayit. Straight in front of you, you're overlooking what was called Zion, what was called Zion. It's the city of David. I was very interested in making portraits of the people of Israel as the people of the Bible. And I call them biblical portraits, which is kind of a lack of a better term. But of course there's no such thing as a biblical portrait, but this is our effort. This is Eshet Chayil, for instance, you know, a woman of valor. And then this is my image of Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, with the face glowing there. And there may be others here. Yes, this is an image of Tamar after Yehuda leaves the tent. And so what I've tried to do in these portraits is evoke the story. This is a set of greeting cards that we call the Way of the Patriarchs. The Way of the Patriarchs was originally a 10-minute PowerPoint presentation with 130 photographs, a narrative, and some Shlomo Carlebach music in the back.
Gray clouds carrying the heavy rains of late winter have scarcely blown away when the mountains of central Samaria are suddenly redressed in the white and pink blossom of the almond trees. It is easy to be so taken by this first of spring's spectacles that one may not see the significance of the site of the tabernacle at Shiloh, adorned with this particular flower.
We took 18 of the photographs in the presentation and made a series of greeting cards, and on the greeting cards, each greeting card has an image from Israel. It's a nice folded card, but on the back we have a nice Bible verse and description of where the photograph was made, and something that relates to why that image is the same as it was. Why does this image relate to Israel today as the Israel of the Bible? How does that work? So this image, for instance, we have a verse on the back. It says from Nehemiah or Nehemiah 8:15, "Go forth unto the mountain and take palm branches and branches of thick trees to make a booth." Well, to modern Israelis, they're going to think about Sukkot, and of course Sukkot is a biblical holiday festival, and here are the booths, and here are the palm trees, and here's the mountains. So we understand that when the text was saying that, it meant it literally. It wasn't some dream idea. You have palms and you have mountains, and you make a booth to commemorate the Almighty's protection of children of Israel as they wandered through the desert with no place to stay or to call home. So there are other images. As an example, we have an image when you go to Shiloh, or Shiloh as some people like to call it, and you see almond blossoms on the site of the tabernacle at Shiloh. There's a verse in Numbers 17 that says, "Behold, the house of Levi was budded and put forth buds and bloomed blossoms and bore ripe almonds." Well, that was when the authority of Moses and Aaron was being challenged by other tribal leaders, and the Almighty instructed Moses to put all of the staves, the princely staves of each tribe, in front of the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant. And in the morning, Aaron's budded with almond blossoms. Now, when you go to the site at Shiloh, where the homes of Levi, or Levi, the tribe that Moses and Aaron were from, you see almond trees growing all amongst the ruins of the houses of Levi. And it's quite a beautiful sight that you just see as you walk along the Way of the Patriarchs, the Derech Avot. The Way of the Patriarchs is actually the name of a highway that goes up central Israel, and it was in ancient time, and it is today. It's the actual highway that we read about, that Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov all traversed as they came into the land and traveled out, like when Jacob went up to Haran in this week's Parsha. That was the highway he took. One of the wonderful things about being a photographer is you get such diversity in your experience. You're able to, one day be in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and the next day be in the desert or in the mountains or along the seacoast, and you get to take in all of what is there. Also the interaction with people. I mean, photographing people. I started out with portraits, and know, it's such a vital part of explaining who Israel is, knowing the people. I'd say that in the experience of being a photographer, it's been totally integral to my understanding of who I am and who Israel is. So I'm grateful for the opportunity I'm just grateful that it worked out like this. I'm grateful that I've been in photography, and I'm grateful that I've done it in Israel, and I think that, God willing, I'll be able to help others see through the lens that I've seen through.